Of a recap of yesterday. We started off in the morning just getting a general overview of the landscape, finding out who we are, the different programs, the different ships, the different concerns, the different considerations that are going on. We did talk a little bit about we had the discussion on the event logging, the human mediated logging, a little bit of discussion on ship to shore transfer, and then we did get into discussions with WebPinner and also David Pablo Cohn about OpenVDM and OpenRVDAS. So that is some of the software being used to bring different material together. So those are a lot of the data pipeline elements. Today we're going to be covering some different topics. So we're going to be starting with some discussions of sensor metadata and in particular some of the vocabularies that are being used. We'll move into a discussion of quality assurance and quality control, and then probably get into some visualization tools and maybe discussions of environmental data versus the infrastructure data. So I'll also repeat what I said yesterday, which is this isn't intended to be a lecture series where there's just one person streaming information at you and you just sit back and say, okay, well, that's very interesting. This is instead intended to be a discussion, just like you would have at a table with your peers. So get the issues out on the table, get on the same page, build a community, learn to say, oh, I know that person and I feel very comfortable reaching out to them, emailing them, know that they've got similar issues. Maybe they have solutions, maybe they don't have solutions. If they do have solutions, I can borrow them. If they don't have solutions, well, let's try and work on it together rather than working on it all independently. So that's the general theme of this. So you can see the plan up there, but that's what it is that we're going to be discussing. So before I move any further, any questions from the floor or any reflections, thoughts from anyone? Don't have to, but just wanted to open it up. Going. All right, go on. So we're going to turn our attention to sensor metadata. And I know that we had a brief introduction to it yesterday where we talked about there seem to be some camps, I won't cast it as a versus, but there are groups that primarily use the NERC vocabularies produced by NODC. There are also some that tend to gravitate towards the climate forecasting variables. I do know that climate forecasting variables are incorporated into the NERC vocabulary. I think it was P06, somebody correct me if I'm wrong. But it would be good to get a sense of what vocabularies people are using, in particular, because this is where you get a lot of your interoperability happening. So at this point, I did warn Tess that I might put her on the spot, but Tess, just to break the ice in terms of the, from the AADC perspective, can you give a little bit of an overview over the vocabularies that we're using and how they've been set up and put into place? Can you do that?
Yeah, sure. So we've gone along with the NERC standards as much as possible. Oops, sorry, I'm just chatting with Peter, the other data officer on the ship. Let me just mute that. How do I do that? Sorry. Yes, so anyway, we have a couple of gone with the NERC. Sorry, this has got me in disarray. You did put me on the spot. Here we are. There's that big page. So for the sensors, we're using the L22 device notation. I had some chats with some folk at the SUSE conference, which happened in Hobart a couple of weeks ago. And that was great to get a list of which particular vocabularies people were using and for what, and writing down a couple of extra ones that we haven't captured on our end. But ultimately, we kind of keep them in what we call the Noyina API, given our ship as Noyina, Postgres database, and we just have them along in our instruments / sensors table, and then also alongside our parameters table. It's definitely not complete. We are looking at the moment to request some more parameters to be built from NERC. But yeah, the categories we use are the L22 device notation, the L05 category notation, and then the P01 parameter notation for the parameters, units of measure, P06 UOM notation, and P07 CF notation are the ones that we're using. But yeah, I would actually love to hear more from you guys about which parameters you use if you are using this vocabulary.
And I think Peter has a YAML file that that helps map some of that. Is that correct? Or is that mistaken?
We did have that. That was when we were going through at the very beginning, when we hadn't mapped any of them, made a little basic web app, which has since been extinct, that we could just like go through everyone to kind of map them all up. Because like the currently in our parameters, we have like 2,846 parameters coming from our sensors. So it's just a phenomenal job.
A lot of information in there.
Okay,
yeah, thank you. That's a good introduction. So again, that's sort of what we're using in the Australian Antarctic Division associated with RSV Noyina. What about other ship operators? Are you using? So actually, let me start with a show of hands. So who in the room is making use of vocabularies? So a lot of them. Okay, so similar show of hands. Who is using primarily climate and forecasting? Well, not primarily, but you're using primarily climate and forecasting. And who is primarily using the NERC vocabularies? So that's a fair divide there. So so from the operators that are using vocabularies, can I hear your stories? I'll put you on the spot because you're one of the CF people. So go ahead.
And I think that's just historical.
Yeah.
Uses CF because that's what we started using at the beginning of Investigator. But yeah, right now as we're transitioning systems, I think we're looking to probably change that and be more community along the same lines as the rest of the community.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So how do you use the vocabularies? So in general, how do you apply them? What do you use them against?
Well, all of our underway data mostly. And that's just, it happens at the time when we build the data outputs, map whatever we've got. But I think when we actually built the software that was creating the files, we used the vocabularies at that time.
Yeah. So did you have to hand code them in, I'm guessing?
It was before my time, so I'm not sure. I imagine that's how it was done at that time.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, it's just a genuine question from me because it's good to understand sort of how it's being used. Yes, at the back, Caddy.
Sorry,
Okay.
I just kind of had a follow-up question. You said that you're transitioning into NERC from CF.
Well, I'm not sure, but I think probably if that's kind of the common standard that direction people are going, we haven't settled on.
Okay,
yet.
no,
So
I misunderstood because it sounded to me like you were in the process of transition and I was like, how is that working?
we aren't there yet, so we're probably at the start of deciding where we're going.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
what.
Okay, thanks.
Do we have any other people that would like to talk about the work that they do with vocabularies or how they are using them, how they are applying? Because we're also talking a little bit upstream at the moment, but you can also imagine that the interoperability needs to be also applied downstream. There's no point in putting in all of this effort if it doesn't end up being used. So, Corinne?
Yeah, we're probably not as far along in that we are working on adding in the NERC vocabulary at the start of our processes, but historically and until now, it's been done after our collection by R2R and other organizations that we pass our data onto. So we're trying to include it earlier at this stage, but we're pretty early in that adoption.
Thoughts from elsewhere, Alex?
Yeah, I can give a bit more. I mean, similar to the Tess's descriptions, we heavily use the sensor model, the L22, and it's kind of more general, the platform LO6 and LO5, which is the kind of grouping terms. So we use those. If we were to put parameters out, we would P01 would be the obvious one to use. The other ones that we're looking into in terms of sensor metadata is the semantic model that BODC have put together, and there's a whole series of vocab tables that group. It isn't just BODC. There's an international group that got together that looked at sensor ML and brought that into the marine realm, and there's a bunch of tables that they've materialized that like W0 tables that are at the base of their sensor metadata, their semantic model. And that has then been taken by colleagues at in the ship system team within National Oceanography Centre, which is slightly separate, all of the same umbrella organisation as BODC, and they have worked out a database structure that can hold it in practical terms for the actual text on the ship to be able to put sensor metadata in, but then can still be then pushed back to BODC, who can then operate at the slightly higher level, the semantic level. So there's something that on a practical level will work, and we are at BAS, we're trialing that. So I've got an outstanding task it's part of, it's one of the modules within the data logging system, is the sensor metadata.
So do they have an introduction to that system at all? Because
So for the semantic work that was done, I can provide a link. There is a repo that has much of that information. There is a landing page, some of it going back a few years ago. I can't remember whether it came out of RDA work. I'd have to check that out. But most of the information I've got is either from online, which anybody can get, but also with direct conversations with Gwen and Alex Kokonaki at BODC, who have obviously, well, Alex especially has driven it from the conceptual side.
And so I think it would be good to probably expose or to build our collective understanding of that work. I think a lot of people are familiar with the NERC vocabularies in general, but they may not be sort of applying it in the same way, I guess. So
just the specifics, those particular vocab tables, the semantic model, are the kind of things where you would put things like sensor specifications in. So if your spec sheet tells you that you've got an accuracy between here and here, there is a term that means the accuracy of a sensor that you can, instead of saying it in the 10 different ways that you could say accuracy, there's a term that is meaningful and that you can apply lower and upper bounds to, for example.
Yeah. And I think that that's important, because again, this is where you end up getting a lot of that interoperability down the line as well. So yes, go ahead, Petra.
Yeah, I just wanted to draw attention to two more vocabularies which have recently been introduced to the community, and that's the observation platform event actions and observation event platform processes. And that's something that we discussed a little bit yesterday about the event loggers. It's perhaps not the final version because I think there is still room for improvement in both vocabularies, but I think it's a good start to standardize terms for event actions and processes being used in event loggers to record various activities that take place during the deployment of instruments ownership, but also can be used essentially also at stations or for claim, recording of information from air geophysics, for example.
Okay. No, thank you
These,
for,
they are actually called EL1 and EL2.
great. Does anybody else have anything to add in terms of, yes, Susanna, please.
We make use of the vocabularies for platforms, sensors, parameters, etc. But on the other hand, if we want to submit these metadata files to the Antarctic metadata directory,
Yes.
we have to use the global change master directory. So
Oh, so there's a mismatch.
yeah, this is an issue because we have to map
The terms
the
between.
terms, and we are not uploading all the metadata that we have. Sometimes it's difficult to find marine terms.
Yeah.
In the directory
Okay,
keywords.
okay.
So is there perhaps a difference there between vocabs as data parameters compared to keywords and metadata?
Are they being used as keywords or the parameters, are they being used as keyword entries or are they being used as metadata fields? Is that what you were asking?
Well, so we looked at, before you joined the data center years back, we looked at using the NERC vocabs in our metadata, but they're not compatible with GCMD, and we were using GCMD keywords. All the NERC parameters are very, very, very detailed, whereas the GCMD keywords are broad.
But it's fundamentally keywords. It's the keywords.
Yeah, so one are definitely parameters, the other ones are just basically keywords.
Yeah.
And so we separated them out of our metadata and just kept them for data collections.
For example, the science keywords, it's the same as parameters. There are also instruments.
Yeah, instruments is the big overlap.
Instruments, it's yeah. It's the
And
big overlap, yeah.
GCMD is instruments. It's a completely different level. I mean, they mean, semantically, they mean the same thing, an instrument and a sensor, but the instruments on the GCMD list are, they're US centric. They tend to be big satellites, that kind of instrument.
Yeah.
Whereas we want a particular sensor that goes on a CTD.
Yeah.
You need tens of thousands more in there if you want to tag up a CTD metadata entry in your data access system.
Yeah, no, I can see the mismatch. I'm on the spot at the front of the room, kind of wondering how you would reconcile that between GCMD and NERC, and I'm not sure of the way through that. Yeah, I just don't know. But yeah, we'll mark that as a thorny issue that it would be good to have some compatibility or ability to crosswalk the metadata terms to the vocabulary. Yeah, go ahead.
Semantic mediator.
Sorry, semantic
Mediator.
mediator.
Yes.
We need a
It's-
semantic mediator.
We call it SMED. That's what we've been calling it. So that's part of what we've been developing at CCADI. I think we're mostly done. I mean, CCADI is actually up and online, so I'm assuming that it's working. But that a lot of these questions came up. Not so much between like NERC and CF because we included both of those, but when we did have those kind of how do you convert questions, one of our developers, well, we created the architecture and then we created the mediator to hopefully do that and deal with things like keywords as vocabulary. So I'm not necessarily the person to talk about the logistics and the details of how that works, but I can put people in touch with either Peter or Alex, or I don't think Amos worked on it, but some of the people that did that work.
Manish worked on it. He's here this
Oh,
afternoon.
is he? Okay, there we go.
So
So we have
that's,
some details floating around.
no, that's an excellent connection, and this is the value of getting everybody in the same room. So we'll try and see if we can potentially do some work on getting that a little bit more interoperable. I also know that there are questions and concerns regarding sort of the GCMD in general, and I see Taco. Yes, I know that the GCMD is a long-term concern, and so we may need to think of other ways.
So just on that, the NERC vocab service does also attempt to provide a mapping between, I mean, that's, you said that the CF terms are in there, they do host a, you know, not live version, as in not primary version of that, and then map it to other similar vocabularies in very similar ways. But the problem they will have, and you presumably also have, is it's like an end problem. Once you've got to decide whether something comes in, and once you bring it in, you've got to map it to everything else that's in there. And that's fine once you've got 2 or 3. But once you start getting 10, 20, 30, that you have to, you know, and new versions come out of every one of them, it becomes
To the
well,
power.
it doesn't, it becomes a non-human problem. It becomes, you have to then rely on some AI, then it just becomes just a language.
Yeah.
You know, a mass language thing, which I guess GPT is perfect to deal with. But specifically for GCMD, they took the decision, or NERC took the decision a long time ago that, you know, BAS had to keep supporting it because of the SCADM decisions. But the rest of NERC gave up on GCMD ages ago. So BODC specifically has absolutely no incentive to map any of the GCMD terms within. So I think they did used to host them a long time ago. In fact, you probably can go on and find a very old version of them, but that stopped like a decade or more ago. Their attempt to hold a version and map to other vocabs.
So I'll be provocative and open up a big can of worms. What would it take to jettison the use of the GCMD terms? Would we need to move completely away from using the Antarctic metadata directory, and would that be what would be required, moving more towards a schema.org folder type model? Is that what would be required? I'm seeing nodding from Taco. Yeah, this has been a bugbear for a while. Okay, so
I think that the GCMD would, or the AMD, would become one of the nodes in a larger network.
yeah,
That would also mean that we probably don't have to, or don't want to, add our metadata into the AMD. We may do that, but
The other thing is, from what I remember, it's been awesome to look at NERC stuff's very specific. So it deals with polar vessel data, like that sort of underway data collection. It's not going to help a biologist, for example, who's collecting
Yeah.
stuff on terrestrial, whereas the GCMD could do it.
yeah,
So that is and isn't true. I mean, it obviously its history is out of the Oceanographic Data Centre.
Yeah.
So clearly it started with an emphasis on marine science, but marine science spans many disciplines to start with.
Yeah.
So you already have to have a lot of biological terms for.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the people like doing moss research. And,
No, so I realize that it's very specific things to do with terrestrial domains. It doesn't have it, but it widened some time ago to encompass NERC, which encompasses a whole bunch of, you know, geological and central ecology and hydrology. And yes, it still has a predilection for marine science, but it is meant to be a community, a UK community. Well, it's a global community resource, but funded through the UK. But the research umbrella is all of environmental science, so that's how it should be. So over time, I expect it to be far more for P01 specifically, to cover most domains, but then there is clearly other science domains outside of that.
Perhaps another way of thinking about it as well is that NERC vocabs help with interoperability, whereas GCMD keywords are perhaps more suited for discovery. That'd be fair.
Yes, so I mean, it's similarity. GCMD should be compared to ISO or 19115 or something. You know, that's its equivalent.
They're operating in different spheres.
But in our systems, would it also be an option? Because I think that we may get into the situation where regardless of how much we try, one dictionary may not be able to suit it all. Do we need to have, I have seen this in the past where you have combinations of dictionary and term. For 98% of the situations, we may use sort of NERC as the dictionary and pick their term. But would we, in some cases, say that we are using the GCMD dictionary and specify their term? Is that a possibility? Because I think it will be the situation where you won't be able to have one dictionary to rule them all. Nice. Okay. And any thoughts from our experts at the back about, you don't have to, but sort of the dictionary term combination, is that?
I'm actually thinking about how we would do that.
Yeah. So just to give you some time to think, I remember dealing with Simon Cox of CSIRO, and I think he had experimented with this concept, or if it wasn't him, it was something like that. But it was the notion of you can identify it as part of the turtle triples, the dictionary and the term versus the dictionary term. So that ended up being sort of a six channel item as opposed to a three channel item.
So that is part of CCADI, how we've put things together. So I'm just thinking, I'm thinking about the turtle file actually. So when we did the metadata in particular, so I worked mainly on the metadata, but I also worked on specific use cases with half and that kind of was a concern, because what we ended up doing was picking and choosing from several different vocabularies, but having to be clear about why, so within the documentation itself. But then, you know, if it's going to be, we don't want it to be our standard, we want it to be accessible to everyone. And as a result, a lot of it is doing what we're doing right now, where you're kind of going out and seeing what people are using. But there were certain cases where we would make a decision in order to broaden the definition rather than to narrow it. And in those cases, we did find ourselves using kind of a similar keyword, but with a different sense. And so I think that the biggest issue is getting it to be a community-wide initiative as opposed to just a single project initiative. And I think that these are the places to make those decisions and to kind of get community buy-in to do so. Because if there are, you know, 2 or 3 projects that are doing it, that's great, but it's integrating kind of everybody into it that's the real tricky part.
And this is part of, especially what I wanted to have the discussion on this morning, is getting that broad acceptance of the types of vocabularies we're using and trying to understand where the exceptions are. I'll also admit I'm talking a little bit out of my depth, but I think where I saw some of this discussion was in use of JSON LD, where they were sort of linking off to the different dictionaries, and that helped solve some of this. So like I said, I'm talking out of my depth, but at least that's the link for people who know a little bit more. Yeah.
You can kind of expand on that a little bit more. So we do use JSON LD. We were talking earlier about how to keep the vocabularies updated. And the way that we have done it is actually using Perl that links directly to the vocab servers. And so every time that whatever that vocabulary is updated, it is automatically updated in CCADI. That took a little bit of doing, but I think that it's worth it, and it's a good long-term kind of process to have in place, because it keeps you from having to be aware of the updates of all of the so that kind of cuts down on some of those problems. I don't know if that kind of answers part of that question.
Well, presumably that gives you then a big work list every time a big update occurs on a third-party vocab. Presumably it then goes through and goes, you've now got 70 terms to map that you can't automatically map. Please advise.
Yeah, it depends. I think it depends on, it depends on if they're additional terms or if are they terms that are already being used? Are they terms that are already within the system? We haven't been in a situation yet where we've had an update that's broken everything, but that's not to say that it won't happen. Which will provide me with, another 2 years of funding. So I think some of that is wait until it breaks to solve the problem. But I mean, it's definitely, I think there are two directions here, and one direction is the community direction. The other direction is what's actually going to physically happen in terms of the data and in terms of the mediation.
Yeah, please.
So my colleague, Manish Madden, who will be here this afternoon, is doing that kind of work for the Polder Federated Search. Every time a new system is brought online into Polder, he's the one that actually goes through and checks all of that and tries to make sure that it's going to work within the system. And it does take a little bit of doing, but you kind of do it case by case. And as Rebecca said, if some of the terms are already there, it's not as bad, but we can maybe pick his brains a little bit.
Yeah, if he's going to be coming, or if they are going to be coming. Yeah, Frank.
Yeah, I think it's also, it's probably good to use different vocabularies for different things. And you don't have to have if it's just sensors, but if you have geographic locations, you should just refer to gazetteer instead of having pick one, but it doesn't have to include, and probably is not included in I don't know. Or the other one more relevant here is maybe having vocabulary for cruise names that are being used. That might be one. I think Atra is using UNOLs or something for that, even though they have their own vocabulary. Atra, for a lot of the sensor stuff and things. So I think you can have different, link to different dictionaries, vocabularies, depending on the different types, so you don't have to.
Yeah, and I think there's a balance to be had, and I think this is one that has come up all the time, where you don't want to have links off to everywhere, but you want to have some flexibility. It's this balance between consistency and flexibility. And so I think, at least in my experience, this is where it comes down to conventions. There are things that people mostly use, but then you want to give yourself the ability to adapt and change and grow over time.
The ISO metadata standard certainly lets you link to multiple vocabs.
Yeah. So
What is so flexible about using multiple vocabularies? Because then you have to map those vocabularies to each other.
and I think that's probably,
That way you could then use the NERC and GCD keywords at the same time.
You still have to invest in the mapping exercise.
and I think there's,
You know for sure that the term in one vocabulary is exactly the same as the one in another vocabulary.
Do you? Yeah, you could, but if you had a metadata record, you're writing it up and you're just having keyword, for example, most people, even with the AMD keywords, we have to provide GCD keywords and the ISO one. So I guess I would say there's just an extra one of those. If your record is of marine or underway relevance, then fantastic, slap in another 50 NERC keywords as well as some of your GCMD ones. I would see it as making it more compatible with more things, but That's just my.
I'm going to agree with, so in some cases, your point is correct, Taco, but the top level case that you talked about there, the top level search terms, like the 12 that ISO or 16 that ISO have is at very top level, the kind of inspire type terms. They are semantically very difficult to match those together when you've got things like agriculture versus some other term that isn't quite agriculture. And at that point, it's impossible from a language term. But we have to adhere to a search mechanism that has to work for GCMD through as the directory. So you have to then, so at that point, you can't actually link. It's a fuzzy link. So you have to definitively say it's GCMD. And for our purposes, we also have to expose them through an ISO compliant metadata portal. So you have to explicitly then target a search term in ISO, and we have to keep those. We have to do that work if we want them to work in those two particular portals. In that sense, there's no way really round the semantic issue without the top level providers of those terms sitting down themselves and saying, "Right, we will standardize ourselves," but there is never one.
We might also
To rule the world. But on a censored term, if you get down to a lower level, then you do get into your question of, if you've got a whole bunch of CTD sensors, say, in one vocab versus a whole set that are in another and they're duplicated, then that is a problem that probably could be solved at a community level where people can sit down and say, actually, these are so similar that we agree to standardize properly. And that's where something like R2R has, in some of the cases I've seen, they've come out, done their own local vocabs, and then went, actually, look, there's an 80% overlap with L22 in NERC. Let's give this up. Let's just abandon our local efforts and move to something that's got more global reach.
And that may be a good framework. I was just thinking in my head as you say that it is true that we want to avoid duplication, but some overlap may be inevitable. And so overlap isn't necessarily a bad thing, but you don't want complete duplication, especially if you have 100% duplication, then you just want to choose one or the other. But in some cases, if you have very different domains, but there is a slight overlap, it wouldn't hurt to overlap them in that case. So I think this is probably the complication, is that there's a gradation. It's not a hard and fast barrier. It's just degrees of overlap and how comfortable or uncomfortable we are with that. Any other thought? Yes, Petra.
Just also wanted to point out, it might be also worth it if you describe a variable and you don't have the term for the whole variable, you can also just consider to use already existing vocabulary terms which are part of that variable. So you would use vocabularies for components within that variable, and it still gives a little bit more understanding, generic understanding, what is that full variable describing, even though you might not have that in specific terminology. You can have the components in the terminologies and then use those to describe the extended variables, which might be also a value.
I'll probably also, this might be going off on a little bit of a tangent, but I'll share some information that I saw when I was at the International Data Week last week. They were discussing an initiative called CDI, DDI. And I don't know exactly what it stands for, but it's a way of actually describing data sets in a formal way such that they could be unpacked and reshaped. And so I think that there may be some scope for incorporating vocabularies with that to help with the reshaping. The reason that I'm bringing this up is that I'm thinking about, as we said before, it's good to be able to mark up our data with these vocabulary terms, but we also want to think about, larger interoperability down the line. How do we leverage this interoperability in order to do things? And so I did want to bring that to your attention, that I think that CDI, DDI may be providing a way to leverage that interoperability and deliver downstream. Others from around the room in terms of concerns about vocabularies, what's working, what's not? Are people generally happy or are there things that they aren't delivering? Yes.
I wasn't here yesterday. I should introduce myself. So I'm David Goodjoe, the head of electronic engineering at BAS.
Yeah.
Your vocabulary terms are really good, and I've looked at the sheets Alex has shown me, and I understand these things. They're really good. Or as BAS especially, it doesn't extend very well out of data management.
Yeah.
So we have engineering teams making instruments with scientists where we have like conversational language problems already, like glaciologists classically use a term called repeats, which is just sampling as far as I'm concerned. And so, and that's the same thing described in two ways already. The work you're doing with these language things could do with extending earlier on in that process before data is even generated. The point where engineers and scientists or engineers and groups talk about how this instrument's going to work and function, which would probably make data management life easier by the time we get there, because we generally make a thing and it starts making data and then data management teams get involved, and by that point we've already mucked it up. It would be really good if these big language maps and these things could be used earlier on by the science communities rather than just at the stage they are, especially at BAS.
Yep, no, that's a fair point, and that actually leads in for us. It's quite relevant. We have an engineering team within the Australian Antarctic Division. They manage the sensors. They've been forced into this world as well, in that they're also managing our Open RVDAS instance, and our data officers have been looking downstream in order to have unified terms, and we've set up a small group within the Antarctic Division called our Change Control Committee, and the Change Control Committee is at the interface of our polar technology professionals and our data professionals. And I know that there's a lot of headbutting on both sides, and I'm sure that we grieve one another, but at the same time, I can say that there's been some very genuine resolution of that sort of material.
And I can see places where like genuine mistakes have been made in like hardware development or final product design or all sorts of things, where just using a standardized set of language to describe what the problem is and what we want to do to fix it would have resolved many issues about a year and a half before we really know.
No, this is very good, and it helps us to get out of our own internal data bubble and think about additional user communities that we can plug into. So that's a great point, and thank you.
And on the wider point, I mean, Dave's team is an example of a sensor manufacturer, in-house sensor manufacturer. But in reality, many of the terms that we're talking about, some of the lead of that should, in time, go out to the sensor manufacturers themselves. They should be the ones that, the free text data spec sheets should be could easily, with industry standardization, could easily be brought into something that we could ingest immediately instead of taking it out of a complex PDF document. Same for all the parameters. So, they should be. It should be the sensor manufacturers saying, actually, our new sensor produces this. We need, a dozen new parameter codes to describe what this sensor would be. And when it passes it out with the code. We don't have to do the work after the fact spread amongst, dozens of different data sets.
I'm also going to admit, I'm going to talk out of my depth yet again, but in the spirit of genuine conversation. I was involved with a program way back called the Ocean Data Interoperability Program, ODIP, which was run through Europe. And I know that they were looking at having applying vocabularies for manufacturers and also for particular sensor terms. I know that they were having a crack at it. I think that what they did is they did go out to the manufacturers and they did try and have this discussion. And I think they got some buy-in from some manufacturers and some manufacturers saying, well, come back to us when this is a little bit more mature. And I think that this is a perennial problem, is that industry, they're mainly looking to look after their bottom line. They are willing to serve their customers, but I think that they want to have a sense of, is this a real thing, or is this just going to be, or are you just wasting time? So where I'm going with this is that I think if we were going to approach industry to try and have them sort of align with these vocabularies, I think we would want to have our case well presented and together on our side before approaching them in an uncoordinated way. I don't know what has been done or what hasn't been done. That's just speaking from, I've seen a previous experience where it was well intentioned and it was well received, but then it kind of seemed to fade out. I'm not sure if that's 100% relevant, I'll warn you, but was anybody else here involved with ODIP or knew about ODIP?
I knew of it, but I
Yeah.
haven't been involved.
Yeah, so I would say in terms of history, it may be worth revisiting it. Because again, I do know that they really did want to get sensor, a standard sensor provider vocabulary in place.
I don't know what the experience is around the room, but I haven't encountered a single sensor or instrument that has provided data or metadata that ascribes to any regional or international standardized vocab or ontology. There is obviously lots of move towards standardized access, not esoteric ways of actually getting the data from it, through either industrial standards or other ones. But the actual semantics of what's coming out of it is entirely. There might be some similarity across a particular manufacturer, across its suite of instruments, but I've seen no attempt. That might not mean that there are R&D efforts going on behind the scenes, but in real world, I haven't seen anything.
And this is reflective of, so even within the data space, we often talk about FAIR. People have put the emphasis on the findability, the accessibility, and people are realizing that the interoperability is a lot more challenging. Again, I don't know the answer to this, but is the IEEE looking into any of this?
Not particularly, their focus is almost, at the moment they have some big focuses, but their focus swings so much onto very high level comm standards and things at the moment that sensor output descriptions they probably consider a problem for other groups. They would consider the IEEE problems to be the comms that comes out of the instrument, the electrical standards, the safety issues, but describe your sensor.
How you use it as your business.
They think of everything on the entire world in one go, rather than thinking sensors for scientists probably wouldn't even cross their mind.
Okay.
And it might just be a research area thing, because if you look at IoT type stuff, if we talked about Influx yesterday, we use similar timescale DB, which is an extension. If you look at all their end users, so time series database end users, there is vast amounts of people who are wanting to use time series data, but I've seen a vanishingly small amount of people talking about standardized, vocabs. They're looking at just how do you deal with billions of data points, and how do you get it out to end customers, how do you make money out of it? The fact that whether one temperature is exactly the same meaning as another temperature for a sensor is a way low order on that. So I think it's, very much is a research element thing where we definitely need to know whether a temperature in this thing means the same as a temperature in another.
Yeah, and I would also say for industry, it would be a low priority because they want you using your product. They don't really care about,
Have you ever had a conversation with Failport about Seabird? They hate each other. It's quite miraculous. So the idea of collaboration in that space is challenging, probably.
They would much rather have it be harder to use.
In many ways.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yes, please.
Maybe I will kind of disagree with what you said, or make it worse. I'm not coming from the same community as yours. I'm coming from Barrier to entry is much lower. You can just buy the components, you could just go somewhere. For us, we work mostly in the mountains and a little bit in the polar regions. You can just go out, put your stations. And actually the problem that we have is that people don't want to use this kind of systems that you can have all this metadata and so, because it just, even in the research world, because it just costs much more time. And they're thinking, okay, why do I care about learning with GCMD vocabulary and all this stuff? I can just get my station, I put myself a few metadata I need, whichever way I want, and I get my station out and work is done. And I think it's a problem because we're striving to get more and more completeness, coverage of everything, the whole meaning and everything. So it's getting more and more complicated, and it's getting less and less usable, or it's a higher cost to get into a system. I've been involved in the development of the OSCAR metadata system for the WMO. It's great. You can describe the whole deployment of stations and everything in very, very fine details. So far, one of our stations that we use as a kind of showcase has all of its metadata. The other ones, I don't think anybody uses anything, because you have to get to learn the system, to invest some time to get the data in. And I think it's the same for manufacturers of all kind of equipment. It's going to be okay. You need to learn all this system to pull all the data. Well, it's much easier for me to just go into a PDF. I just extract the data, metadata I need, and I'm done.
And so this actually reflects many discussions at International Data Week last week, because there's no doubt that there is an investment, and the investment is on the collector. And so there is a big discussion of what's in it for me. You know, you're asking me to do this, you're asking me to understand about the standards or participate, and then what's in it for me. And there was quite a lot of discussion there about the benefit comes from the collective fabric. And we especially see this in the polar environment, where it's incredibly expensive and hard to place such a system. And when you're facing grand challenges like climate change, you need to be able to integrate that together. And so in some sense, I'm preaching to the choir here, but it's this message that yes, it is an impost and investment. However, what you can get out of it is greater impact in the larger community. And I think that's probably the message that needs to come along. And in the weather systems, you do see this with large scale interoperability, because you have to have that in order to get these global research outputs, these global models, these global products. So, other thoughts in terms of vocabularies or other things that we've discussed? No? What about Corinne, do you have sorry, no, nothing on this?
No, I'm kind of thinking about, because from my point of view, it's not just this, but it's connecting it into the whole pipeline. So I'm sort of thinking about how you manage those changes along with sensor swaps and things like that. So I'm in a slightly different space.
Mm-hmm. That's the hardest bit. We can invest time, because we don't actually have an IoT problem of millions of sensors distributed around a city. We tend on most marine platforms to have hundreds, if I don't know if anyone's got thousands of things. Hundreds, but not millions.
He's promised to get you there, Alex. No.
So the initial setup and description can take some time. Those things tend to have longevity. So, but the creation of systems of sensors, that's the thing that does change on a sometimes minute by minute basis. Well, maybe not minute, hour by hour basis on a busy scientific cruise or any type of platform. And they're the amorphous things that are difficult to track in real time. And the concept of a platform that changes hour by hour, how do you track that?
From my perspective, that's getting easier every time we buy new kit. I mean, the amount of equipment we now have that outputs voltage is going down or outputs RS-232, and the vast majority of those sensors output serial numbers. So like we barely have to track those changes. If we log the serial numbers, they track themselves. So over time, assuming that we move away from logging raw voltage, which is a horrible thing to do anyway, it reasonably tends towards systems where your instrument or your piece of equipment outputs its serial number, potentially its model. Most of the kit we have in the SDA does that at some level. And then you don't have to have someone running around finding out what's happened. It just is in your data file.
Unless you want the description, and this comes to the tension between how much detail you actually go into. Unless you want a description of how that platform is uniquely configured, and I don't mean just the fact that you put one in.
You mean like the physical dimensional changes?
Yes.
Yeah.
You've actually, some part of it's broken, you've shifted it up here. And that matters not a jot. So 90% of the people are like, who cares? It's a temperature sensor, it's gone down to the bottom, it's come back up again. And then someone says, well, where was it on the frame? Like, well, it couldn't be where it normally is. We shifted it up here. And they're like, you need to tell me that because it's useless there, as an example. And that's the thing that unless you need other sensors then, unless the human's going to record it, you need something that tells you where it is on the, and CTD is a great example because it encompasses almost everything that we want to talk about as a system of sensors. That's the kind of thing that's trickier to track. You're right, you can track serial numbers, you can know that one's come in, one's gone out, but the configuration, the changes, maybe one's not working quite as well, and maybe that changes how you'd want to describe the configuration. That's a tricky one to deal with as time goes on a cruise.
You've also opened up another line of thinking for me as well, which is, I don't know about Bass or the others. We have combinations of, we have kit that is provided by the Antarctic Division, but sometimes we get scientists bringing their own. And sometimes when scientists bring their own kit, it comes in various shapes and forms and levels of support. Sometimes it catches fire, sometimes it doesn't. But where
that sound like it's one of two options here.
Oh, there are plenty of options besides catching fire. I mean, honestly. But what I'm sort of thinking about is requirements and support in terms of telling people what their equipment needs to do if it's going to be aboard the ship and how much support needs to be provided.
We try and do that.
Yeah.
And we almost always get listened to. In order to access the SDA, you need to fill out a marine, or any of the NERC ships, you fill out a marine request form where you describe some things. And when you describe those things, me and some other people read them. And then we send you more surveys about specific bits of equipment. We tend to focus on, at the moment, we tend to focus on things that are very large integration jobs. So that's me doing workforce planning more than anything else. But that questionnaire you wrote some of, and Alex wrote some of, and it does cover an array of both like IT networking questions, data management questions, and more practical constraints. It is working, although because of what we currently pick to, currently we mainly ask questions about big, horrible running cable through a ship kind of jobs.
Yeah.
In theory, we could expand it to just about anything. It's just a work level problem at that point.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of stuff to learn.
And that is specifically for things that are potentially on for longer than a defined cruise leg.
Yes, but that's a choice, not a necessity.
But for the things that come on for one particular cruise, we deal with those in the cruise planning system. So we have similar questions that we pose a year ahead of the cruise that are slightly less maybe detailed than the people who want maybe to keep them on for a year, 2 years, but they are a similar version where we ask them.
It's just a subset of the same question.
Yeah, engineering questions, data management questions.
Yeah.
And obviously for that particular cruise, you might get, a large number, and those things do sometimes catch us out because things can change right up to the last minute.
Well,
I was gonna say, my question for you is, how often is what the scientists or people in charge of the sensors put in their early information actually
consistent with what they.
10%.
So what they put in their, funding proposal, it's completely, that's just imaginary.
Use of very high resolution ocean general circulation model to explore climate questions in.
Martin, I think we hear you, unless you have a question. Martin, you there? Hello?
It's all right, we'll mute him.
Okay.
Mute him.
I'm being mean by saying 10%. At the moment, the SDA has a problem that many people made applications a very long time ago, which for us means that the realities of what they want to do and their proposal are much further apart than they were in the past. I'd say in reality, most of the stuff that goes in a proposal, most of the stuff that goes into the early planning is true, and our cruise planning meetings are only a year ahead, if not less. So normally that counts different.
Yeah, some of them are only 6 months before, so by that point,
Yeah, if you don't know what
the
you're
science
doing,
party is fairly fixed.
it's normally a few months before the shipping deadline. So if you don't know what you're doing when you're shipping your things, you're
in trouble.
Yeah, so we do, and that is the advantage. Is that the shipping deadline gives us the delay required to stop things. You know, you can only hand carry things that can become problematic at that point, which it can still be problematic, but
and you can't do that with the MOD. So
yeah.
that just makes sense.
So yes, it would be different. Our colleagues in NOC would have a difference if you can just drive up.
For once, our logistics.
An hour before the cruise starts in a big van, then you.
But for me, this is interesting because it sounds like you're ahead of the game in terms of having sort of a science data engineering
We have
discussion.
We have a science support authority, which is a great name, but it's lab management, data management, IT, and mechanical and electronics engineering, who meet on a monthly basis, along with some people like ship engineering. So that's the people who deal with compliance issues for ships, not science issues, and operational planning and some other bits. So they meet once a month, and solving some problems like this were things that we took from issues we had in our previous vessels. We wanted to nip in the bud early on this point.
No, but it's a good business process, and this information is often stuff that you wouldn't find out about any other way.
It's led through a coordination role, which is one of our senior scientists at BAS who represents the science community. So it isn't just science support making editorial decisions on what goes in. There is the science lead and a scientific community that also.
And so sorry if you said it already, is operational support involved with that group as well? So
our ships operations, ships engineering. So our engineering is a little complicated, but ships engineering is is our ship legally operable to sail? Like big compliance.
Yeah.
Those guys, who else is in that?
Our logistics, the cargo flow.
Cargo and freight. Because for us, cargo and freight rules the world.
So again, this has opened up another channel for me, because that's sort of the larger like a larger operation, which would tend to have a lot more machinery surrounding it. But I then turn my attention to small vessels or small deployments, or if somebody wanted to toss an ROV, sort of into a bay, you would still probably want to think about that.
In our case, most of the things where you chuck an ROV into a bay, you do from the ship. They're not particularly accessible, and so in reality, that process works quite well. There are some cases where it doesn't. There's a whole nother set of processes for doing these kind of operations from our station, which have nothing to do with what we just talked about. So deploying from Rotherham or AEP or somewhere would go through the equivalent station processes, which are somewhat different.
So I'll get to you in a moment, but is there sort of a similar technical requirement through the station process?
Do you want me to talk about it?
Yeah.
The station process is a lot more wobbly than the ship. So because there's a very large number of data sets, it's not organized into cruises. So it's a lot more, those projects come in far more small bits and bobs. And the data managers are organized by organised by. The data managers for the stations are far more organised by subject, not by location. And so the overall result of that is it's a little less consistent than the station side is. But the stations do have, there's an engineer responsible for station, a science support engineer responsible for stations. They also work with data managers. And in general, they all have to work together to get that stuff through. So the gateway isn't quite as clear, but it does exist. For some of our stations that are very inaccessible, the gateways are actually quite well structured and built, because, I mean, a good example is if you mess up sending something to Halley and have to send it home, you'll send it back in 3 years. That's the logistical timing we have, or 5, depending on if you need a ship. Because the ship goes every 2 and how all the shipping works, you kind of get it right or wait half a decade. And so some of our bases have much more firm gateways, which have data management involvement. And some of our stations, the islands are less solid on that and stuff. They're also more accessible, so.
No, I'll go to Frank first, but you made me think of something else. Yeah.
I mean, the US perspective comes maybe from it's totally different. I mean, there's gonna be discussions and somebody brings an instrument in, like, okay, I mean, how much deck space, how much power, like how it's gonna be deployed and whatever. But then, you know, the scientists bring in their own computer, and the only data stream maybe for the ship is, okay, when it was deployed, when it comes back in, and, you know, they can record their own data. That's the extreme other end, and there's no discussion about data, and it's not going in the general data stream, and it's up to the PI basically to deal with the data and make it available.
And so you've touched on sort of what I was thinking about, is that we have these, you know, power requirements. This is, you fit into this power environment, you fit into this water environment, you fit into this space environment. It may be worth starting to think about, well, this is the data environment that you have to think about operating within. You know, just like you wouldn't exceed certain voltage, or you wouldn't exceed a certain amount of consumption, you may say, look, for a particular project, this is the data environment, and these are what our requirements would
We
be.
can make that questionnaire available if people are interested.
Yeah, I think.
Like,
Yeah, because it's not specific to us.
In fact, the ship questionnaire is a bodge off the Halley questionnaire. Like, we have them for various sites, so I can show you those.
Yeah.
So on that point, some of the stuff that we put for things that are going to stay on for a number of years, say, we need to have more oversight of those, because those people will not be on the vest for large periods of the time when the sensor is on. So there needs to be clear lines of responsibility. You know, we are effectively, collectively supporting that in the absence of those individuals. Even if they can get remote access, you know, programmatic access to it, they still can't do anything if, you know, that requires presence. So there is those things, but then for scientists that are coming down on a particular cruise, like that bring a particular instrument, we go through and describe the kind of the advantages of being part of the data management system, the synchronization, the potential underway data logging through to the loggers and to the central systems for backup and preservation purposes. And most people want that. They want to be involved in that, because that gives them security that, you know, priceless data doesn't get lost on their local acquisition PC. So then we can get involved in data management best practice about how they might want to do that. It's what we do before the cruise, and when we support the cruise, one of the data managers supports the cruise itself. However, I fully agree that if they were going to the actual NERC data policy, which is that they have to supply, if they're NERC funded science, it's not all NERC funded science, if they wanted to go by the NERC data policy, they're required to provide the data within 6 months of data acquisition. They could say, actually, I want nothing to do with you guys. I'll record locally and I'll adhere to the policy by giving you the data, you know, in 6 months, just like the time set.
Yeah.
Vanishingly small numbers of people do that. They engage on board, and we don't have this standoff situation. You know, the guidance is given, it's gratefully received, and we almost always have a full copy of all the data that was acquired. Do we have it all with all the beautiful metadata that we've all described? Possibly not. We probably don't have the time to, you know, give it a complete sensor metadata overview of whatever it is that analytical machine that they've brought. But that's the working model. It was the working model we had effectively on the JCR, and it's what we'll continue with on.
Yeah, we certainly don't get everything all the time. This is why we have Dave as our squishy human in the middle to whip people into shape. Any other additions that people would like to get into? We're getting very close to break time, so I won't force it, but I do want to give everybody the opportunity to ask questions or add to the conversation. No? Oh, Petra.
Maybe just a brief comment to the discussion we had about the incentive for scientists to use standards. Maybe one of them could also be to demonstrate the machine readability of the data that are produced, which are, if they use the standardized terms. There is a lot of discussions now about creating digital twins of the ocean. Without the standardization, this would not be possible.
Yeah.
So probably that also might be an argument for scientists to put some effort into using the CF terms, using NetCDF file structure.
And a sweetener that was, again, talked about with IDW, we talked about this controlled information is the use of ORCIDs, because what you would do is you would say, if you can provide us with this information, including your ORCID, that makes it a lot easier for us to track impact and also connect it with things like digital object identifiers for data sets. And so you say, look, if you can organize this information up front, including your ORCID, we can do a much better job of saying, how your information is being used and impact tracking. So, yes.
But I think it is really the key that we need to have applications that can show the people what is the value of adding more metadata. If you imagine, for example, you want to publish a data set. If you would say, okay, now your data set, you're using NetCDF, CF, you have all this ACDD metadata, and so just put it on a repository. All the information you need to provide is already pre-filled, taken directly automatically out of your data set. Then it's a very strong motivation for you to prepare the data with the proper metadata. If you have to fill it manually, you just do it manually. But here you could have a benefit already. And everything that you can automatize and show as use case is a very strong argument to say, hey, look, it's working. It brings you something. Invest some time to do it, but then you get an immediate benefit. Same thing for ORCID. It would be, okay, your data, you're more fundable, more people are going to cite your data set, then you have an immediate benefit. And I think it is really key to adoption.
Yeah, I completely agree. But tomorrow we will have a maybe brief discussion about the SUSMA, which is a portal for standardized data sets. Without that standardization, nothing of that could be possible.
Yeah, and I think it is important for us to be able to build that balance, because it's one thing for us as data people to say, trust us, it'll be lovely. And if you put in, 10 hours of work, it'll be great. And, they'll put in 10 hours of work and another 10 hours of work and another 10 hours of work. And they'll say, so I don't feel like I'm getting anything out of this. So I think we definitely need to keep in mind this, make it worth their while and demonstrate why it's worth their while, and not just an abstract, because you should, or because it'll be nice, or some far off promise of interoperability. There has to be some backtrace. Any other points? Otherwise, we actually are close to the break now. So we'll probably have some opportunity to discuss with one another, raise questions. Otherwise, we'll get into a larger discussion of quality assurance and quality control once we're back. Okay.